The Trump regime and the Christian fascists who support it want to make queerness, and particularly transness, just disappear from American public life. And they're doing that in all kinds of ways. Yes, they are trying to scare us. They're not only trying to scare us, but they're trying to stir up fear against us. They want to deprive us of our rights and even of spaces where we can openly speak. All of these different initiatives are designed to push us out of public life.
Welcome to episode 234 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism exposes and analyzes the threat we face, promotes efforts to defend people targeted by the fascists, and most essentially, challenge, mobilize, and inspire the non-fascist majority of people living in the United States to engage in determined, defiant collective action to defeat Trump and MAGA fascism. First, I want to thank our patrons and sustainers who make the show possible and invite them all to a discussion that's taking place this Wednesday, January 29th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. A link to register is on our Patreon page. So Patreons, be sure to check it out and look forward to seeing you there. Thanks to those sharing the show, everyone who buys our merch, like our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, to support and spread the show. We are going to be having beanies and sticker packs available. So be sure to go to our shop and get yours. You can see the show notes for details. A special thank you to those who help the algorithms that help grow our audience by rating and reviewing the show on Apple Podcasts or their listening platform of choice. They boost the show so much. And here is an example of one of them. Eva5457 titled her Apple Podcast review, What We Need, gave us 5 stars, thank you, and wrote, "This podcast needs to be on your list. We need this information now." Thank you, Eva. And hopefully after listening to today's show, you'll be inspired to rate and review the show and share your thoughts to help others find this resource. Today, we're running an interview with Chrissy Stroop, senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches, co-founder of the feminist blog, The Flytrap. She has the very insightful Substack, bugbeardispatch.com. So you're going to want to listen. We've had one full week of Trump 2.0 in power. Between the time this is recorded Sunday afternoon and the time it's uploaded Sunday evening, it's likely that Trump will do something else that shocks the conscience, that negatively impacts millions of people, and which further erodes the rule of law. It is overwhelming. Elon Musk's Nazi salute has become one central symbol of the fascist regime's moves upon taking power. It's extremely apt. Symbol and spectacle are central to the fascist strategy. But while the New York Times refuses even to recognize a blatant Nazi salute, all too many have their eyes and energies on the salute, while missing or downplaying the Nazi words emanating from the stage, the Nazi directives being signed into action, and the thoroughly fascist character of what is rolling into power. Dozens of executive orders, with more dropping each day. Outrageous cabinet appointments, suspending and disrupting large swaths of the government's basic functions, directly challenging the Constitution, and more. It's been described as a blitzkrieg, which is extremely appropriate as the term refers to the Nazis' method of rapid, overwhelming attacks. It is a method used not only to inflict maximum damage, but to disorient and demoralize the enemy. And in large part, it's working. People are outraged by every story they come across, frustrated that each of these targets seems so vulnerable, feeling overwhelmed by unmet needs in every direction. It's a situation which leaves those in the crosshairs feeling exposed and alone, with those who haven't been targeted yet unable to figure out who to help, what to do, and then largely putting their heads in the sand. But does it have to be this way? It is overwhelming to try to catch every outrage, but it is grounding to recognize that the fascist regime is instituting one cohesive program. It is one package, and that package has a name. It's fascism. Fascism is not just the worst of Republican policies, it is a qualitative change in the form of rule, the obliteration of all the norms, the evisceration of the democratic rights we have been told that we have, like the ability for people to oppose them in the streets, in our protests, or even within the halls of power. Fascism is a form of rule that relies on open terror and violence from the state and from the mob against all they deem as their quote-unquote enemies or undesirables or quote-unquote dangers to society. So fascism must be what we unite from diverse perspectives and backgrounds to oppose. And if we correctly analyze what it is, fascism, we can meaningfully talk about what it will take to defeat it. Parts of the fascist program, like denying election results or prosecuting political enemies, rip up established norms and rules. Other parts of the fascist program, like unleashing ICE and the police, feed off of issues that are embedded in those same norms and rules. When we recognize that it's fascism, we recognize that simply reinforcing those norms and rules will not suffice. In years past, when the Republicans would swing into office, the Democratic Party appeared to be a central hub of opposition, flanked by the nonprofit sector and liberal-leaning media outlets, together providing some semblance of unity against the maneuvers of the proto and wannabe fascists. That was always much more the perception than the reality. But today, it seems that delusion has largely run its course with the fully fascist GOP steamrolling forward, and a Democratic Party not even pretending to resist, and even enthusiastically collaborating. If we recognize its fascism, it becomes clear that we do not need a ruling class party to integrate, feed off of, and often divert our struggle against fascism. What we do need is a common understanding of what we face, and a refusal to silo our struggles. We do not need and cannot chase and tackle every outrage, but in every act of defiance, every act of outrage, every act of service to those targeted, every day we walk out the front door, we must make clear our wholesale rejection of the whole damn fascist package. I've got more to say about what needs to be done and what we don't need, but first, let's look at what's actually happened this week in broad strokes. In his first days back in power, Trump has already changed the way that state power is exercised in the US. I will not cover every outrage, but I'd like to highlight some of those that exemplify the program and the leaps we have already witnessed. Only a week in, he has fired at least 15 inspector generals whose job it is to oversee federal departments and prevent them from violating laws or engaging in corruption. He has put into effect Schedule F to do away with large swaths of civil servants in order to replace them with Project 2025 pre-approved political appointees or to strategically understaff agencies he doesn't like. He suspended external communications from the National Institute of Health and turned the Justice Department's Civil Rights Office into a bastion of white Christian male resentment. Or, as Trump puts it,
we're bringing back religion in this country.
He's threatened to do away with FEMA and importantly mentioned a Christian fascist charity as a potential replacement. He has used presidential pardons to incite violence against his political opponents, his January 6th fascist shock troops, violence against abortion clinics, and to signal to police that their murderous brutality will go unpunished, straight from the White House. In word and deed, he is making clear how bellicose and unrestrained in their fascism they intend on being, and how they have completely dispensed with concern over even the appearance of abiding by the rule of law. In word and deed, the Trump regime is seeking to silence and punish dissent within the government and private institutions, while also pardoning and backing the fascist thugs to unleash their revanchist program and intimidate and terrorize those who would resist. On immigration, Trump has unleashed ICE and the Border Patrol, declaring that nowhere is off limits. Not churches, not schools, not hospitals. He's expanded, quote-unquote, expedited removal, bypassing even the notoriously cruel immigration judges. And he's revoked legal status for hundreds of thousands of refugees. He's expanded the militarization of the border, effectively shut down the legal asylum system, officially declared immigration as an invasion, and deputized thousands of federal agents to arrest immigrants. While many of these actions have had immediate consequences, perhaps the most ominous is his revocation of birthright citizenship, possibly the most direct attack on the rule of law a president has ever made, which is currently halted by a federal judge as it likely works its way to the fascist-dominated Supreme Court. He has targeted civil rights protections across the board.
I signed an order that will end all of the lawless diversity, equity, and inclusion nonsense all across the government and the private sector. We abolished 60 years of prejudice and hatred with the signing of one order, all approved by the United States Supreme Court. We're allowed to do it because we are now in a merit-based world. We're a merit-based country.
Redefining gender with immediate impacts for federal health agencies, for federal prisoners, for passport applicants, and potentially much wider effects for trans folks and for abortion rights. Listen to House Speaker Mike Johnson at the March for Life now.
And I don't know if you saw his executive order on gender, but it defines life as beginning at conception rather than birth.
He's revoked an order signed by Lyndon Johnson in 1965, ensuring equal opportunity for federal contracts, protections from discrimination for federal contractor employees, and more. He suspended programs for diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility across the entirety of the federal government and stopped the Labor Department in its tracks from investigating cases of discrimination in the workplace. He set up foreign students for deportation as a consequence for engaging in constitutionally protected protest actions. Around the world, he has cut all foreign aid, except that for Israel and Egypt. U.S. aid serves many functions, for good and bad, but it's clear that this blanket cut will kill, for example, through cutting the PEPFAR program, providing HIV and AIDS treatment for more than 20 million people. He has unilaterally pulled out of the World Health Organization. He has also escalated his belligerence toward Panama and Denmark in his pursuit to seize massive territories from them. Even as an unstable ceasefire holds in Gaza, he is taking America's unqualified backing for Israel's genocidal slaughter and strategically escalating it into a full-on end times crusade. He has officially exited the Paris Climate Agreement and evoked an energy emergency, clearing a path to overcome all limits on fossil fuel extraction. And we cannot ignore or downplay the confirmation of Pete Hegseth as Defense Secretary, as he was pillared by Democrats for infidelity, alcoholism, and lack of qualifications. Not one senator dared to question the white Christian nationalist beliefs of this serial sexual assaulter. But the fact is that his very public male supremacist, white supremacist, war crime cheerleader, Christian supremacist bona fides are exactly why Trump picked him, why 50 fascist senators voted for him, why J.D. Vance came down to break the tie. For those folks, as hard as it is to fathom, Hegseth's violence against women is a confirmation that in his heart, he's their guy. This that I've detailed is only a fraction of what Trump's done in week one of his term, and he and the Republican Fascist Party is clearly just getting started. More times than we can count, Trump has shocked the conscience of the world. More times than we can count, experts have cried, he can't do that! That's illegal! But he does it anyhow. If Trump is allowed to consolidate power, all this will be unspeakably worse. What we have warned about has come to pass. The only way to make sense of this nightmare is to confront that fascism is here. The only question now is, will the people in the United States allow it to consolidate or rise up, defy, refuse, and defeat it? So what do we do? What can we do? First, we need to remember that tens of millions not only do not support the Trump regime, but actively detest everything Trump and MAGA represent. This is a strength that we can't lose sight of, even as visible resistance is largely out of sight. But this private hatred, this perpetual quiet loathing, or even the rage tweets, posts, TikToks will not stop this regime from steamrolling the rights and lives of people in this country and around the world unless we harness it, channel it, mobilize it into a visible, unavoidable, relentless refusal. We want to salute those who are resisting. We want to shout out those in Georgia, Washington State, Honolulu, Illinois, who have sent photographs of the ways they are spreading and acting on the imperative. In the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America. Raising it on banners and signs, bringing it into protests others have organized, and holding their own. We want to salute those who took to the streets in protests on Inauguration Day and declared no Trump, no KKK, no fascist USA, and those who've gone back to the streets this weekend in Chicago. We want to give cheers to Led by Donkeys, who teamed up with German activist group Center for Political Beauty to beam Elon Musk's Nazi salute with the words Heil Tesla onto a Tesla gigafactory in Berlin. We send appreciation and respect to the lawyers working to gum up the works, to Trump's program of ethnic cleansing, the teachers and school administrators pledging their defense of children in their care against the regime, the religious leaders condemning and defying, the doctors insisting they will continue to care for and protect their patients. Cheers to everyone getting trained to protect their neighbors from ICE and from anti-LGBTQ+ and anti-abortion thugs in and out of power. Cheers to those joining ICE watches and clinic defense. All of this is needed, and all of this needs to grow and strengthen rapidly, rooted in and aimed at refusal of the whole fascist program. What's needed in the next weeks, yes, weeks to come, is an awakened force of collective action to defeat Trump and MAGA fascism. This force needs to create such significant society-wide disruption to business as usual that the fascists are unable to rule any longer, let alone carry out their fascist program. This is what we must urgently build, starting, honestly, 10 years ago. It matters that they face defeats quickly and that we create a positive dynamism between legal battles and struggle in the streets. They want us. These fascists want us to accept inevitable defeat. They want us to feel alone, overwhelmed, and powerless. Don't give it to them. None of it is true. Their victory is not inevitable. You are not alone. You are not powerless. And while it is overwhelming, we must not become overwhelmed. Our power comes from us carrying the hopes and aspirations and interests of literally billions of people around the world. Our power is in our ability to become ungovernable. It is us fighting to arouse and call forward the millions in this country that don't want to become accomplices to ethnic cleansing and fascism. It is us pushing on the cracks and deep divisions that exist all throughout society. This is possible. No, not on our own, but together, committing that we will not find our place in a fascist America, that we will move heaven and earth to prevent it, that we will lead others to overcome fear and get out of their comfort zones as we do the very same ourselves, that we will do this not for ourselves alone, but for all of humanity. But Sam, what can I actually do? Like an ordinary person like me, what can I do? Well, first, I'd implore you to tell that voice that says I'm only one person, what can I do, to shut the fuck up. Obviously, one person can't do it all, but one person can call forth others to join together. One person can contribute their talents and creativity. One person can say yes to their friend who wants to organize an action, or yes to doing a die-in, or yes to participating in nonviolent civil disobedience, or yes to helping a friend sticker or stencil all over their campus, or can be the one person that's inviting their friends to do all that, all or any of that. The days of being surprised must be over. That doesn't mean we become numb to atrocity, but that we are not thrown off by the fire hose of fascism. We confront the problem, and that problem is fascism, rapidly consolidating, but not yet consolidated. Lift our friends and neighbors' heads out of the sand, reminding them that the fascists are counting on our acquiescence, and that humanity is depending on us to refuse this American fascism. It's time to stop confusing accommodating with resisting, stop looking to the Democratic Party for leadership, as they are cooperating and conciliating and even facilitating atrocity right now. I mean, voting for Marco Rubio in the Lake and Riley Act is not what refusing fascism looks like. You, listening, are probably not a senator, but you will be presented with what may seem like benign choices to maybe vaguely acquiesce to fascist norms. Don't do it. Don't vote for Marco fucking Rubio. Instead, look in the mirror. Look in the eyes of your family and friends who refuse. Look in the eyes of strangers. Trump and the Republic fascists are counting on you to double down on the very institutions which they've either weaponized for their fascist aims or which they don't feel bound to. The fascists thrive on the oxygen we give them, on their ability to wreak havoc unopposed. Let us take a page out of Bishop Buddy's book, to speak truth to power, but let us not stop there. Speak truth to each other. Being uncomfortable now is infinitely better than the suffering these fascists promise. Go find the people who are overwhelmed, the people who are heartbroken and full of anguish, the people who have confined themselves to bearing witness, and act together. Bring your creativity, your talents, your care for humanity. Bring the defiance against fascism into your congregation. Bring your refusal to accept a fascist USA into your classroom, to your Super Bowl party, to your knitting circle. Bring it into your food shopping trips and your bowling league. Think about the people who make you feel not alone. Go to them and go bigger. People will tell you to find community and follow the lead of community institutions or organizations. But you also have to push those institutions to take commensurate action. And don't wait for them to do what you know is right and needed. We all need to do things that we've never done before. The extremeness of what Trump is going to do, what he is already doing, is actually what provides much of the basis for our collective action if we act to wake up and move millions as we act and stand up now. We should take the right lessons from the beautiful uprising for Black lives and against murder by and impunity of the police in 2020. Millions in the streets filled with courage and conviction, in the face of great violence not backing down and instead coming back stronger, not just once, but again and again and again and again and again. That's how you create conditions where the rulers cannot govern in the normal way and cannot go forward with their program. Some particular things for this week on taking action. First, discuss the show with others and spread the show. Then, on Wednesday, join us in a patron sustainer only event where we'll be discussing Trump's first 10 days and how to refuse fascism. Historian Paul Street will join me and hopefully you. Information to register for the Zoom is on our Patreon page. Sign up at patreon.com/refusefascism. Again, that's Wednesday, January 29th. It will take place at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Spread the imperative through banners and signs that you can find on our website, refusefascism.org, or by purchasing sticker packs available on our shop, beanies where you can wear Refuse Fascism across your forehead, also available on our shop, or wear it on t-shirts, sweatshirts, and hoodies. See the links in the show notes. Whenever and wherever you take action, as long as it's legal, please take pics or videos, post them on social, and tag us. If there is a fascist event near you, disrupt that shit. There are resources in the show notes for defending those under attack as well, so be sure to check them out. It's on all of us to inspire, provoke, compel those who are not fascists to feel that they cannot live another day with the threat of a truly fascist regime that imperils humanity and the planet itself, so that they feel that they cannot stand aside while immigrants are terrorized, while trans folks are erased from public life, where women and queer folks are slammed backwards. Let's make that commitment. Let's make it today. Now, here is my conversation with Chrissy Stroop. It's this kind of week where you need to pull in the big guns. I am so glad to be speaking today with Chrissy Stroop. Chrissy is a prominent ex-evangelical writer, speaker, and advocate. She is the co-founder of The Fly Trap and senior correspondent for Religion Dispatches, and has a really delightfully written, even if the topics are really not delightful often, Bugbear Dispatch. And all of those will be linked in the show notes so that you can read more. But without further ado, welcome, Chrissy. Thanks so much for joining me.
Thanks so much, Tam. Yeah, it's been a long time since I've been on the show. I'm really glad to be back. And despite everything being terrible, I feel like I'm rallying a bit more lately and have a bit more bandwidth to do podcasts and things again. And so it's great to be back on yours.
We're so glad to hear that. Let's just get into it. I feel like the first place I wanted to start with was with Trump's inauguration speech and his opening salvo of executive orders that, to me, paint a pretty clear picture of their fascist vision for America. While maybe not surprising to those of us who have been paying attention, it is nevertheless disturbing. I think one element that has kind of gotten overlooked in a lot of the coverage has been the theocratic angle to both his rhetoric of his speech on Monday and then many of the executive orders that have gone through. And I just wanted to get a sense from you of what stands out to you from this barrage of unbridled hatred.
Well, barrage is the right word. It was a whole lot all at once. And I thought that I was mentally prepared for the inauguration on MLK Day of all days, but I still ended up spending kind of a lot of the afternoon in bed. It just was so depressing. But I think you're right that people, particularly the general American liberal to left public, does have a tendency to downplay the significance of religion and the things that are going on. And that's been a frustration to me because I've been shouting into the void about the dangers of the theocratic right, and particularly the mostly white conservative evangelical demographic that I come from, being a very authoritarian demographic, wanting to impose theocratic views on American citizens in policy for many years now, really since 2015. That's when I was transitioning to getting out of academia and becoming a full-time writer. I do have a PhD in modern Russian history, which is relevant sometimes. And I've written a couple of things for Foreign Policy magazine, but I don't work in the field. I get disappointed time and time again when people write these think pieces like, how can Christians support Donald Trump? They're not real Christians. Well, yes, they are, for many, many reasons that I can go into if necessary. But one example that stands out from earlier than the inauguration is just back when Roe was overturned, and both Susan Collins and Vice President Kamala Harris said, well, we just thought it was settled law. And Susan Collins, well, but Brett Kavanaugh told me it was settled law. Nothing is settled law for these people. So get that idea out of your head. They're going to push things as far as they can. I would say in the first Trump administration, some institutional checks and balances held somewhat, but overall, I think American institutions are very broken. And this time around, they're more likely to break further and faster, I think. So we will have to see. I mean, it certainly very much concerns me as a transgender American. And, since Trump first kind of started addressing and courting evangelicals, he's kind of learned to speak their language. So now he always throws around these things like, well, we don't worship government in this country, we worship God. That's classic evangelical rhetoric that he has learned how to parrot. The funniest example of theocracy on Monday to me was the anti-trans executive order, that it included the language that all people have a God-given sex at conception. Well, if everyone's sex is determined at conception, then I guess we're all female. But this is a president making a theological pronouncement, which is not something that presidents should do. Are there any parts in the speech that really stood out to you that you'd like to talk about?
One, I think it is relevant now, is this golden age comment, which I think could do a whole episode on what that means. But I think in that context, the pairing of the golden age with his chosen status, that he was saved by God for a reason, that he was put on earth by their God to bring a new golden age.
Sure, and spared from that assassination, which they certainly leaned into that during the Republican National Convention.
Exactly, where it was like one after another after another. And that was also on display with the inauguration itself, with Graham and whoever, I don't know that other person's name, echoing it. I think that there was the other minister, I think, talked about that it was a millimeter miracle, that it was just, the hair's breadth. And that's further evidence.
It's classic. It's typical. Actually, in high school, one of my English teachers and also one of my Bible teachers, because we all had to take some kind of Bible class, she asked us to find God sightings out in the world. Something happens that feels like a special coincidence somehow, and you're like, oh, I saw God's hand in that, and then you would put these up on a bulletin board. I'm very familiar with that way of thinking.
And I think that it then emphasizes this mindless mob mentality of, well, if this fear is God chosen, then I don't need to think about anything that they say. Everything that they say is said for a reason. I may not understand it, but God is acting through him and I will follow. And I think that that just is ever more dangerous when you then have the pardoning of 1,500 insurrections.
Right. People who included leaders of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. I mean, Enrique Tarrio is out of prison now. And I can't remember his name, but I think one of the Oath Keepers leaders met with Trump yesterday or the day before. But that's a very sobering fact. I mean, this looks like the potential formation of Einsatzgruppen, Hitler's private death squads. Paramilitary, they were SS people. They were extremely destructive in World War II, but they weren't officially part of the state government.
Well, those particular examples are not individuals that are motivated by their faith. Those two don't see this as part of a holy war. There are those among that 1,500 that do.
I honestly think Enrique Tarrio may be one of them. I mean, if you watch the video of the Proud Boys on January 6th, just before they're storming the Capitol, they do this prayer. And it is like a very classic, recognizable evangelical prayer. Certainly, there's a lot of commingling in recent years between these street brawlers and people who certainly are true believers. If you look back to a few years ago, I want to say it was in 2019 or 2020, it was during the pandemic because part of this was mask and vaccine denialism and defying pandemic regulations, right? So there's this Christian singer, sort of music leader from California. He was associated with Bethel Redding Church in California for a while, called Sean Foyt. And he came to Portland, did a big old maskless street concert, and he tweeted out pictures on Twitter of his security detail, and it included Proud Boys, Patriot Prayer, other local brawlers. They're certainly happy to join with the explicit theocrats, and the explicit theocrats are like increasingly looking to these street thugs to do their dirty work.
Really important point. I wanted to pivot a bit to something that people are rightly, in many ways, celebrating, which is this sermon that Reverend Marianne Buddy delivered at the inaugural prayer service, pleading for mercy for immigrants and LGBTQ people, pleading directly to Trump and Vance.
In the name of our God, I ask you to have mercy upon the people in our country who are scared now. There are gay, lesbian, and transgender children in Democratic, Republican, and independent families, some who fear for their lives. And the people who pick our crops and clean our office buildings, who labor in poultry farms and meat packing plants, who wash the dishes after we eat in restaurants and work the night shifts in hospitals, they may not be citizens or have the proper documentation. But the vast majority of immigrants are not criminals. They pay taxes and are good neighbors. They are faithful members of our churches and mosques, synagogues, wadara, and temples. I ask you to have mercy, Mr. President, on those in our communities whose children fear that their parents will be taken away, and that you help those who are fleeing war zones and persecution in their own lands to find compassion and welcome here. Our God teaches us that we are to be merciful to the stranger, for we were all once strangers in this land. May God grant us the strength and courage to honor the dignity of every human being, to speak the truth to one another in love, and walk humbly with each other and our God for the good of all people in this nation and the world. Amen.
Immediately after, Republican Mike Collins responded by saying that this white, cisgender, American-born clergywoman should be deported. I think this really illuminates how the fascist movement sees what they consider real America versus everyone else, which is something you've spoken.
Yeah, I've been thinking about the semiotics of that. I mean, I just recently published a couple pieces about kind of using Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA, that 1984 terrible country song, as a cultural artifact to get into things like the semiotics of what constitutes a real American for American fascists, and compared that to things that Lee Greenwood has said in interviews. And it becomes quite clear this is a code for patriarchal, Christian, cis-het, usually white. I do think we have to contend with the fact that more Latino and African American men are getting into the boys' club. And I don't quite know what to do with that, but it's still a white model of society, an authoritarian Christian white-centric model. You look at things like when they sing about there should be pride in every American heart, or you look at the details of this song, and you see all these liberal commentators trying to be like, but this song's about unity, right? And isn't it about diversity? And I don't know where you come up with diversity from. In every like fascist or nationalist song ever, from the banks of of whatever to the edge of whatever. There's literally just endpoints on the country. But sure, there's non-white people there, but no, that's not about diversity, right? Like, that's ridiculous. But interviewers ask Lee Greenwood, how can you be so associated with Trump, or how did this song become a rallying point for Trump events when he's so divisive, but the song is about unity? And you look at his answers to that and subsequent questions like, well, what do you think the biggest problem in America is today? And he says illegal immigration with no hesitation whatsoever. You start to get your answer that when he says American, he doesn't mean all of us. He means the people who fit that particular mold. I suppose it could escalate to the point where they could deport someone like Bishop Buddy for attempting to speak truth to power there. It certainly was brave. I mean, she was looking right at the president, who turned away. I want to say good things about it. I'm also a little bit annoyed by some of the framing. This is just sort of my personal distaste for Christian theology and the things that it does, the word games it plays. So she's pleading for mercy for people who didn't do anything wrong. And that just rubs me the wrong way a little bit. But that's my one quibble. And okay, sorry, / Killjoy out. We can say good things about her now. I just don't like Christian theological language because it does that all the time. Like, we're all terrible sinners. Oh, we all deserve horrible things, but so we need mercy. Well, maybe we just need kindness and acceptance.
It speaks volumes to me, the way that C-SPAN moved from focusing on her and moving it to focus on the reaction of Trump and Vance. And in particular, Vance, you can see when she speaks about the humanity of LGBT youth, or she speaks about the humanity of asylum seekers, just the look on his face that what she's talking about is complete garbage. I think these are perfect indictments of the morality and the world that they want to shape and bring into being. And I think it goes back to the point of what's a real American versus everyone else, and who's human and who's subhuman. And I think that that's the undergirding of the theme of this whole week.
And within that, what does that golden age mean that Trump is hearkening to? And that is not exclusively Christian language, but certainly in the sort of Christian model of a Jeremiad. Trump often speaks in what I would call sort of a secular Jeremiad, right? Like, everything is terrible now. A Jeremiad requires you to lament that things have declined, that things have been destroyed, and, then to talk about maybe looking forward to a better era. You're supposed to talk about God leading you there, of course. It's a classic rhetorical form that certainly predates Christianity, but it's used in Christianity a lot. And I do think it's also quite interesting and instructive to compare when Jeremiads are used typically in white churches versus black churches. They're very different because for the black church, typically you're looking at the original sin of America is slavery and racism, white supremacy, Jim Crow, and all of it. They look at that as the fall from a state of grace or what should have been. And to move toward more equality is where you should be going to achieve that golden age. But in white Christianity, it's crime, it's the gays, it's, this is the stuff that you lament, and tough on crime or law and order, that's a stand-in for. Our people get preferential treatment by the law and everybody else gets swept up in legal punishments. So they want to be punitive, not restorative. And, well, look who gets off scot-free. He's now in the Oval Office.
Exactly. The biggest pardon that happened.
Right. It's very unsurprising failure of the American justice system. And it kind of bothers me when people use really sweeping language about felons to attack Trump now, because there are a whole lot of people, often people of color, other marginalized people, who are in prison with felonies because they were caught with marijuana 3 times. And what did he do? He just did a coup.
Yeah, just a little coup.
And a whole bunch of other shit. He also, what's sort of looking for, compromised national secrets, and who's really worse. But who gets off and who doesn't, that's the salient question here.
And who deserves forgiveness and who deserves retribution or revenge.
Exactly. So this idea of a golden age and looking about how terrible things are now and we're going to achieve a new era of American greatness, or however you phrase it, it's kind of a secularized form of a conservative, authoritarian Jeremiad. Jeremiads can also be more liberatory if they look back to things that are actually bad, and they use that religious rhetoric to stir up progressive change. But the white church tends to do the opposite of that.
Yeah, I do want to say that I do have a lot, and we should all have a lot of love and respect for this bishop for giving us a lesson in exercising courage and conviction and looking him straight in the eye and putting it on the line. She knew that she was going to get attacked for it, and she said it anyway.
It was extremely brave and admirable. I think it's just that her theological framework leads her to make this speech in a humble way. And you and I seem to agree that we don't like that. But to do it at all, incredibly brave.
And I think that that has to be the standard. I think already we've seen that it's the anomaly, not the standard. And I think that that's kind of what has to shift very quickly, that we all find the ways to stand up, to speak up, to disrupt, to defy, to, as the title of our podcast says, refuse fascism. But I think that the fact that it resonated with so many people, I'm hopeful that that is not something that it's so American for us to want a proxy, that we don't have to do it. We'll get somebody else to. The DoorDash of resistance.
Yeah, and and I hate to, not like Mueller was ever coming in the first place, but Mueller is definitely not coming this time, guys. Nope, there's nobody is coming.
If the cavalry's coming, you're the cavalry, or it's not.
So I definitely want to encourage people to take a stand like that if they have any opportunity to try to speak truth to power. And that's the fundamental thing that we should take away, not my quibbles with the Christian language of it. It needs to be encouraged.
We've spoken about the widespread reticence for many liberals, even leftists, to talk about the Christian fascists, well, Christianity. But it's impossible to actually understand the campaign against women and also against trans folks and LGBTQ people without really addressing the Christianity part of the fascism.
And just saying, oh, that's not Christianity is absolutely counterproductive.
Right. You can't talk about this war against trans folks, for example, without talking about the importance of rigid gender roles within the fascist conception of a God-ordained order. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why this is so important to them and why are people scared to talk about it?
Yeah, they're both great questions. And so many examples immediately come to mind. Mike Johnson, who has voted absentee many, many times, opposing a proposal to change the rules so that pregnant women in Congress can vote in absentee if they're close to term. He's like, absolutely not, and extremely hypocritical about this, because again, he uses absentee voting all the time. But it's clearly in that case about controlling people who are gender nonconforming, anything like that. The same thing with the bathroom. He makes a big deal immediately of, no, we're not going to let our new trans congresswoman into the bathroom. Why do they do that? Well, it is sort of a funny thing, I suppose, to get hung up on, but also it's very deeply historically rooted pattern, this kind of patriarchy that you find in Christianity. You want to build a case for it from the Bible, you absolutely can, and they do. And I think that's important to understand. I will say that, of course, you can also read the Bible in different ways. Certainly, if you're a little bit more sophisticated about it, you take a more scholarly look at it. You don't treat it as absolutely inerrant in every word, but there are people who do, and they don't care if you say, oh, by the way, the really most misogynistic stuff in Paul might be interpolations, or, he didn't write the epistles of 1st and 2nd Timothy, right? That's pseudepigrapha, that's pseudo-Paul. No, to them, that's just Paul. So Paul is the one who said wives must obey their husbands and wives must not speak in church, they must remain silent, which that one I'm pretty sure he actually did say. Women will be saved through childbirth. This stuff is all in the New Testament. And for everything that people will say about Jesus being radically inclusive and breaking down barriers, sort of, yeah, kind of sometimes, but also I don't really see in the Gospels an absolutely radical push for a change to the status quo on gender. Look, he's a dude who hangs out with fellow dudes, and everyone wants to make the point of, oh, but look, who were the first people to find him in the grave? Women. He was friends with women. Okay. But the point is that scriptures are always ambiguous. A religion, to borrow a term from the anthropologist Clifford Geertz in a very classic essay, a religion is a cultural system. Religions are these very complex cultural systems. They're always subjected to internal contestation. Within the big group, there's all kinds of divisions, and everyone's always fighting about the meaning of things. And then in a specific context, they're always subjected to communally mediated interpretation. So there's material in the text that you can take to build it in less humane ways and more humane ways. But when people are actually taking the text and using it in their everyday lives and referring to it and using it to build something inhumane, you have to take that seriously as an expression of the religion. But that's exactly what liberals don't want to do, mostly liberals, but some leftists do, because they tend to see religion as an inherently good thing. To touch any part of religion is really sort of the third rail of the American legacy media, or at least one of them, although it doesn't make sense to talk about multiple third rails. But there's certainly a lot of taboos. Let's change the metaphor to that. This is one of the things that the press doesn't want to deal with, or network television. I will say the one recent counterexample is Shiny Happy People did a really good job of dealing with this, that docuseries. I recommend that one. They seriously looked at how religious religious beliefs can play out in a very inhumane way. And they listened to people who grew up that way and rejected the beliefs. And those weren't the only people they talked to, but they talked to those people. The extreme kind of radical Christian homeschooling and have as many children as possible, the quiverful ideas, they looked at that and they took it seriously. I think most Americans don't. Certainly the punditocracy, the people who really control the elite public sphere, the gatekeepers there, they don't want to look at it because it makes them supremely uncomfortable. And I think many of them are also quite comfortable with the status quo. And so they would never say something like, as many of these evangelical Christians and some of the hardline radical Catholic extremists do, that, oh, women are not supposed to teach men or have any authority over men. Women are supposed to stay in the home, whatever. They don't care enough about that to feel like it's worth saying that there might be actually a problem within Christianity, or at least parts of it.
I think it's very helpful. And I appreciate, even as you are commenting about the dangers inherent in Christianity and its supremacy overall, I think that there is then the distinction between those who are reading the text and taking it literally and acting then on that, and those who, for lack of a better words, find comfort in it and find a way to use it to bolster and inspire their quest for justice or care or whatever it might be. I don't think that that is helpful. And I think it does harm to not look at the world as it is. And I think we can be very moral people without God.
Of course. Although I would say many pundits don't seem to think so, because they keep publishing think pieces about, oh, religion is declining in America. Is secularization the reason for polarization? No, but I guess you're going to make a really bad case for why it is. Atlantic, great.
Exactly. And then when you keep platforming atheists who are not moral people, then you elevate garbage people.
It's changing slowly, but I will say that still sometimes organized secularism in America does itself no favors sometimes, that's for sure.
No, it's these old reactionary men. The problem isn't that they're old. I'm sorry. They could be young and just as reactionary, and that the problem is their ideas, not their age. But that's a problem. We spoke earlier about some of the Christian fascist language, both within his speech and within his executive orders. You had talked about the anti-trans executive order that had straight up God referencing language. That also is personhood, right?
Yeah, and implied gender determined or sex determined not at birth, but at conception. They're borrowing this language from the anti-abortion movement. Yeah, it's like fetal personhood, and it reads like the kind of language that you would come to try to sell it as secular language when you're actually basing it on is that verse. It's from the Hebrew scriptures, but Christians quote it all the time, and I forget exactly where it is in the Bible, but something about the Lord has made you fearfully and wonderfully in your mother's womb, right? You are fearfully and wonderfully made. So apparently, God knows everything you're supposed to be from the time that the sperm and the egg get together and before, and then knits you to be that. Even before any gender or sex differentiation, right, takes place in the cells, you are the sex that you will be assigned at birth. It's weird. The theocracy is the only way to understand how they would get that language in there.
What do you think the purpose of it is? What, from the fascist perspective, what are they trying to do? How does this fit into their larger plan?
Until people with certain gender markers in their passports try to cross the borders, we don't really know if it's immediately doing anything. And enforcement could be arbitrary. There could be some passport agent at the Canadian border, someone who's coming back from Canada, who would let someone with an X marker for non-binary gender in their passport through, and another who says, I'm going to have to detain you. These aren't accepted anymore. We're certainly hearing that it can't be applied retroactively. So if you've got changed gender markers in your documents now, they will be accepted until you need to renew. And I certainly hope that's the case. But here's what I think they're trying to do. Yes, they are trying to scare us. They're not only trying to scare us, but they're trying to stir up fear against us. I called my newsletter that you referred to earlier the Bugbear Dispatch, because trans people have been the major scapegoats of the American right, of their fear-based fascist politics for the last, going on a decade. And what we're seeing now is a shift of a lot of things that have already been put into place, policies that have been put into place at state and local levels to the federal level. I think we will see more, certainly legislative attempts. They already passed that military budget bill that defunds trans care for the military. So that's bad. And Democrats just instantly caved on that.
Democrats participated in that.
They instantly caved. They see us as an issue to compromise, not even a bargaining chip. They just push us off the table right at the beginning. At least much of the Democratic leadership. That's all very disturbing because if the shit really hits the fan, I don't have much hope that national level Democratic leadership will try to protect us. Now, states, on the other hand, I think could do much better and may do much better. I mean, a number of states have declared themselves to be, what's the word I'm looking for?
Sanctuary?
Sanctuary states for trans people. And I hope they will stick by that. It could be a real problem for crossing borders. I mean, there's a number of things that can happen. One trans person in Florida already had their driver's license revoked. And in Florida as well, and I do think we need to look to some of the worst red states as models. And during his term in office, I mean, Governor Ron DeSantis rapidly turned Florida into just an extreme fascist dystopia. It was wild. He would often go around the state legislature by doing things through the bureaucracy. And we're, of course, seeing that in the Trump administration as well. They will use that playbook as much as they can get away with, because it's always going to be easier than going through the legislature, particularly if any Democrats find enough of a backbone to filibuster in the Senate. But Ron DeSantis has an election police force. He created it out of whole cloth. He did get Tallahassee to fund it. And he used his election police force to basically go and terrorize African-American voters. They were arrested for voting, and he wanted them to be prosecuted. Now, these were people who had been felons, but in many cases, they had received voter cards from the state. And so they thought everything was expunged that needed to be expunged, and their voting status as convicted felons who did their time had been restored. The state literally told them that. In many of these cases. In other cases, they voted in good faith. It didn't change the outcome of anything in 2020. And he had this force that exists apparently only to handle these kinds of things. So they're getting paid a lot of money to, I don't know, play Candy Crush on their phones probably or something. And then every once in a while go out and terrorize a marginalized community. And when local prosecutors refused to prosecute these people, DeSantis threatened, and I think in some cases, if I remember correctly, he tried to fire them, maybe did fire them. I'd have to look the details back up. But he wanted to put people in place who would actually prosecute these felonies of voter fraud. It was just absolutely vicious, cruel, unnecessary. And in some cases, there was absolutely no case for it because the state had issued voter cards to these folks who believed they had done all the things that they needed to do to restore their voting rights, which shouldn't have been taken away in the first place, let's be clear. I think if you get out of prison, you should be able to vote again. But they make it harder than that in a whole lot of American states. When DeSantis then used the Department of Motor Vehicles to declare driver's licenses with changed gender markers invalid, my immediate thought was, this might be another bid to go out and terrorize people for supposed voter fraud or to deny trans people the vote. I haven't seen any documentation that it's been used that way yet, but it certainly could be. And so if they're taking policies like this nationally, I think we do want to play out. Maybe they won't happen, but we want to understand where the worst case scenarios could go. This would be one way, for example, that if they won't let transgender Americans cross the border, or if they stop some trans Americans at the border, it's honestly very weird because, say, someone like me, right, I feel like it could be a catch-22. Let's say I changed my gender marker back to male, and then I try to cross the border and they say, but look at you, you've got boobs. Detention, we have to sort this out. I do think that this would be a way to trap a hated demographic that you are using to stir up fear and hatred, that one of your main others, that you're keeping people motivated by showering hate on us. You could trap us inside the American borders without actually having to go through the process of implementing exit visas, which would be very unpopular and would probably incite a lot of pushback. But if trans people's travel documents are just invalid, then we're trapped and they can do anything they want to us. So is that happening? Well, not right now, but it could. And I just think we need to say that it could. Fascism can escalate to some serious, serious horrors.
And I think a lot quicker than we might want to imagine.
If there's not enough pushback, then absolutely.
Right. I think that that's the dynamic and the importance of the pushback happening sooner rather than later. If you can stop a key measure from advancing now, it's going to be easier, to do. It's going to impact everything that happens after, which is why it's good that cases around the birthright, citizenship, like it's great that cases went right away. I don't think cases alone are going to be enough, but I think it's an important part of the struggle.
It's going to help. It's going to gum up the works for a while, particularly depending on where the lawsuits are filed. And that, of course, became such an important issue with Trump's own trials because Eileen Cannon in Florida was never going to let anything happen to him there over the classified documents case. She was in his pocket for the whole time. And the 5th District is going to let these guys do whatever they want. If you can have your suit take place in Texas, then great. But a lot of the states that are now suing over the immigration order are states where the federal courts that this will first escalate to are going to rule the right way, right? Like the Ninth Circuit. So I'm in Washington, and our state is one of the states that immediately moved to sue on this birthright citizenship order. Gumming up the works, yeah, in the courts, it's helpful. It's a start.
Yeah, we can't rely on it because ultimately where it goes ain't any place good.
I do wonder if even the Supreme Court wants to actually overturn the 14th Amendment, but I do think they'll rubber stamp almost anything Trump wants them to.
If there's a way where we don't have to find that out, I'd like to.
Yeah, that'd be great.
That is kind of more of what I'm going for. Returning to what it looks like and means to stand up in this moment, just thinking about there's many battles and then there's like the central battle of fascism. But if we look at the attacks on the trans community and we see some people in the religious community doing some heroic things, Bishop Buddy is one of them. And then we see some secular folks that have found some ridiculous ways to oppose trans rights. There are undeniably strong reasons, in my opinion, why the fight for secularism or the fight against Christian supremacy, having one religion above all else, why that can and should go hand in hand with the fight for trans rights and trans lives.
Absolutely. I know a number of trans Christians who are like very pious and they want to reclaim the faith. So to say that any one faction of Christians speaks for all Christians is always going to be false. And that's exactly what the fascist Christians want to do. I mean, they claim they're doing Christianity the only real way to do it. And other people don't want to have that kind of Christianity because they can't handle it, because theirs is the tough love. God's going to break you until you become what you need to become. And that's the definition of human dignity. If you kind of scratch the surface under Catholic natural law, human dignity it's conforming to this only one way that God prescribes. But no, there are Christians who believe in abortion rights and Christians who don't. There are Christians who, believe in LGBTQ acceptance and Christians who don't. It's ones who have the power. And it doesn't help to deny that they're Christian. But at the same time, if you want to make religious freedom arguments or arguments about pluralism, you have to take into account that there are these Christians on the other side too, on the good side.
When we think about the struggle for secularism and the struggle for trans rights, can you talk a little bit about how you see that unity and synergy and how that might give us insight into how we unite in the broader struggle against fascism overall?
American Atheists actually has done some of the best work on this in recent years in terms of changing the ways that they do secular advocacy to include advocacy for LGBTQ and women's rights, because they should be understood as, and they certainly are, church-state separation issues. So that is the kind of rhetorical argument that they made to make this shift. And it's happened under the leadership of Nick Fish, who is currently the president of American Atheists. Before him, it was honestly a pretty shitty organization. And its idea of advocacy was being mean to religious people and putting godless slogans on billboards. But they've done serious legal advocacy under Fish's leadership. But he's also hired a very diverse team. Until recently, there was a trans lawyer named Allison Gill, who was their sort of public policy point person. And Allison Gill very eloquently made these arguments about why trans rights, broader queer rights, women's rights, all kinds of civil rights are a church-state issue in a number of presentations that she's given. And they worked with another organization, like a polling organization, to get data. They did a secular survey a few years back with over 30,000 respondents. It wasn't a nationally representative sample because most people were drawn from secular organizations, but they found that it's a lot of respondents, though. It's a lot of data. And they found that overwhelmingly younger atheists, humanists, agnostics, and so forth want to see secular advocacy do more than just say there is no God, and if they make you do God stuff in school, they'll send a strongly worded letter. They want it to be a more robust approach to secular advocacy. And if you look at who is opposing these rights, it is by and large a certain very powerful, disproportionately powerful relative to their numbers in the country group of Christians. That is a salient fact. And in fact, if you look at January 6th, there was all kinds of Christian imagery and symbols there, including the Christian flag that I had to pledge to in Christian elementary school growing up, where we had to say 3 pledges every day: the American flag, the Christian flag, and the Bible, in that order. And it was a very anti-pluralist pledge. The Christian flag was originally an ecumenical thing, but for the last probably half century at least, it's been just an evangelical reactionary thing. And the kids pledged to it in Christian schools. So there was actually all kinds of religious activity around January 6th, very Christian activity. And one of the things I think is positive that we've seen in advocacy for the separation of church and state in recent years is that there were people from different organizations. Andrew Seidel, I believe he was with the Freedom From Religion Foundation at the time, but don't quote me on that. He might have already been moved to Citizens United for separation of church and state. He's an atheist, and he worked with people from the Baptist Joint Committee for Religious Liberty, which are the liberal Baptists. And they worked together to document this and make this report about Christian nationalism at J6. And then basically no major media outlets did anything with it. But it's a good report, and it's out there. In a certain sense, too, certainly in much of America, if you are known to be godless and you're not a super wealthy white male who just likes to be contrarian, and everyone's like, oh, that's just Bill. He gets a drink at the bar or whatever, and everyone's like, oh, Bill, you stupid atheist, I love you, man. If you're not Bill the rich atheist, everyone's like, well, he's one of our atheists, so he's okay. You are stigmatized in most of America, right? You actually are marginalized for that stance alone. And if any one demographic is going to achieve liberation, it has to be all of us fighting for liberation together. It's the only way we're going to achieve it. So I guess that's another way I would say that secular advocacy should be rights advocacy, and vice versa. Not just because it's religious people who are attacking certain rights, which I do see though as very much a violation of separation of church and state. I mean, I think that's a pretty straightforward argument. It's hard to dispute. But also because if we're fighting each other, then no one's going to achieve liberation. And Bill the atheist and his Christian buddies will all watch Jordan Peterson together and rule over the rest of us.
I really hope not. I really hope not. I wanted to return to one of these recent actions. One of the most immediately effective actions of the Trump regime has been to suspend DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, including, my understanding, is like even some cases, and create like this snitching atmosphere where if you work in federal government, you know somebody who is involved in harboring DEI, or I don't know how they worded it, then you must report. And this is really with the intent of abolishing all of it, including going after the private sector as well in those practices as part of this reversing other anti-discrimination efforts. People may not understand or disagree with the framing of DEI. What Trump is going after is civil rights.
That's great framing. Yeah, exactly.
And I just think that just needs to be clear for people. And we know that he has put fascist ideologues into positions in the Justice Department's Civil Rights Office, including vehemently anti-trans staffers, transforming them from nominally protecting the rights of oppressed people to focusing on overcoming the supposed oppression of white male Christians. And I was just hoping that you could talk a little bit about this, how this fits in to their agenda, and what are the key takeaways now.
So it harkens back in some ways to your question about what does this executive order do, or what is it oriented towards, what is its goals. The Trump regime and the Christian fascists who support it want to make queerness, and particularly transness, just disappear from American public life. And they're doing that in all kinds of ways. And I should also say, though, at the federal level, I mean, they're putting people in departments to undermine what those departments are actually supposed to do constantly. That's very Orwellian. It's just kind of a hallmark of what they do. But they want to deprive us of our rights and even of spaces where we can openly speak. It is very possible that just our very existence will come to be defined as pornographic, even though there's a whole lot of different approaches to sex and sexuality, and any queer person is not defined by sex, but conservatives can never get over that it's all just weird sex acts to them. And I think also because patriarchy is so threatened by this notion of feminization of men, more so even than the masculinization of women, although that's certainly not encouraged, it's a little more tolerated. That goes all the way back to the British Empire. I mean, this is an old impulse. They can't think of trans people as anything but, oh, men in dresses. That's so weird. They don't even really recognize the existence of trans masculine people. It almost just never comes up. they don't seem to think about it. They are fixated on men that they think have like abdicated their manhood, and this is a very scary and threatening thing to them. All of these different initiatives are designed to push it out of public life. We've seen it with drag bans or attempts to ban pride parades at state and local levels. In Montana, there was one instance in which a trans woman was barred from speaking at a library under a drag ban. So they've been going after Drag Queen Story Hour for a number of years. They tend to conflate being trans with drag, and they don't care to understand any nuances there. And so it's been clear that for a long time that public indecency laws or anti-drag bans or things like that could be used to try to push queer people out of being visible in public, back into the closet. The next step is these porn bans, because if you look at it, there's chapter and verse right there in Project 2025. It's laid out the approach that they want to take to it. You basically define drag or being trans or just gender nonconformity as something that is sexually explicit, which it isn't. It's absurd, but if you define it that way, you can perhaps argue that, oh, well, then these people need to have labels on their websites, or they need to be kept off of certain platforms because children might see it. So I think that's where it's very possibly going. And it's funny because it's the same people who are always saying, oh, my free speech. What they mean by that is really only for them. I mean, it's quite hypocritical. So they want to disappear trans people from public life, and that could be accomplished. It's violence no matter what, but it could be accomplished perhaps without, rounding us up and putting us in camps with mandatory conversion therapy or worse, but it might also escalate to that. You just don't know at this point.
And the possibility of that horror coming to pass increases when the decent people sit back and do nothing. I wanted to end our conversation with your thoughts on what resistance means, what refusal means in this moment. What does that look like, and what do people do? I think that people look on the surface and they see the horror, and then they see inaction, and because no one's acting, they don't, and it just reinforces itself into like this paralysis cycle. And I was wondering, what does refusing fascism mean now?
Yeah, authoritarian regimes, they want us to feel overwhelmed and powerless, but they always overextend themselves. They're arrogant, and if enough people push back, they will crumble. They rely on us all being individually afraid and not acting collectively. But I will acknowledge that those fears, that sense of being overwhelmed, is very real, and we can't all do everything. We can't just magically fix this. The thing I think that might be helpful for people is think about what they can do in their own community. And the more that the federal government tries to deprive marginalized people of rights, the more important it's going to be to advocate, to push for the blue states to nullify those laws and simply not acknowledge them within their borders. If they try to not just overturn Obergefell, but say outright pass a national ban on same-sex marriage, California, New York, Oregon, Washington, all the other blue states need to just say, we're not doing that. Fuck you. But then there's also battles over libraries, there's battles over school boards. I know a lot of people in the trenches who are doing really important work there, because just protect the vulnerable where you are as you can. If you are a state employee of some sort, let's say you work in food stamps, and they tell you that you are supposed to report undocumented immigrants, don't. If that costs you your job, if you go to jail for it, that's the best thing you can do. And it's going to be costly sometimes. But if people aren't willing to make those kinds of sacrifices, then we're doomed. I don't know how quickly it might escalate to something like that. Probably you lose your job bad enough if you're trying to raise kids. Look, I get it, life is expensive, but we need people to just be willing to say no and to gum up the works however they can. You mentioned these email addresses or hotlines for denouncing people. Well, culture of denunciation is another hallmark of an authoritarian regime. And at the state level, Republicans have been cultivating this culture of denunciation that is part and parcel of authoritarianism for many years now. They've done it in Texas with that law where you can get a $10,000 bounty if you sue someone for having an abortion. Gum up the works. You can send fake emails, fake tips to these lines. For legal purposes, I'm not advocating that. I'm just saying it's a possibility that some people might engage in sometimes. You got to disobey sometimes. And I don't want to abandon those in the red states, but for those who are the most vulnerable, it's going to be dangerous. And you may want to consider getting out. And in those red states too, particularly if you have more privilege and power, you can be the person there fighting at the school board, fighting at the library. You can do that sort of stuff. You don't have to do everything. You just have to do a thing. And if the time comes, you have to be ready to disobey.
Chrissy, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, to share your expertise, your perspectives, your insights, your time. Where where should people go to read more and connect with you? Do you want to share your Blue Sky, or we'll of course link to your Substack and whatnot?
Yeah, my Blue Sky is also under Bugbear Dispatch. So I think it's still www.bugbeardispatch.com.bsky.social. Anyway, it shouldn't be too hard to find. I'm glad to see Blue Sky growing. It's still a place where the moderation is decent and people block Nazis on site and they just don't get very far. And there's a lot of my work that I write for Religion Dispatches. My own newsletter is the Bugbear Dispatch. I will say, yeah, it's a Substack. Yeah, it's a shitty company. But, I was kind of already in it and I'm not making enough money that I can just easily leave. And so I think we all navigate what platforms we immediately abandon and which ones we stick with. It's impossible to be totally purist about it. Maybe someday I'll move to Beehive, but I'm afraid of losing paying subscribers because I honestly can't afford to lose any of it. So people can also support me on Patreon if they want to, patreon.com/Stroop. And I'm really excited about the new project that I'm a co-founder of, the Flytrap. We're trying to bring back that early 2000s energy of the feminist blogosphere without some of the kind of less productive elements of it, like the endless debates over is it feminist. We don't particularly find that always the most interesting thing to debate, but we're giving you good feminist cultural criticism of all kinds of things at the Flytrap. So I would love if more people would subscribe to that as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam. It's been great chatting with you.
Before we end today's show, we're sharing a song that will make you smile. Listen to Jesse Wells.
Oligarchs were to be expected, CEOs and their wives to boot. What came as a surprise was not once, but twice came the big Nazi salute. Oh, buddy, Mr. Musk, edgelord troll of the land. Mr. Musk knows just what he's doing with his hands. Something about all the excitement and fervor got the strange man dancing like a German Führer. Meta, Apple, Amazon, TikTok, Tesla, now the game is on. Them folks don't have me and you in mind. It takes a mountain of bodies just to climb that high. And now it's quasi and plastic, technocratic, fascists doing Sig Heil salutes out and into the masses. They dump a big smoke bomb, make a distraction, signing tons of weird shit into executive action. They need you divided, not agreeing on nothing. Keep the greed machine oiled up and running. Hate is a poison, but it's making them money. Takes balls to stand up and be like Bishop Buddy.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Patrons join us for a Zoom discussion this upcoming Wednesday, January 29th at 8 p.m. Historian Paul Street and myself will be leading a discussion about Trump's first 10 days and how we refuse fascism. The Zoom link is on our Patreon page, patreon.com/refusefascism. Not a patron yet? Become one today. Again, that's patreon.com/refusefascism. Be sure to spread the imperatives. You can find sticker packs and beanies back for ordering on our store, so be sure to visit our shop to order. And we still have shirts and sweatshirts and hoodies available to help you share the imperative, so see the show notes to get yours. Be sure to tag us in ways you are acting to refuse fascism. We're at Refuse Fascism on all the platforms, including Blue Sky, and I'm on TikTok for now at Sam B. Goldman. Share the show with others, rate and review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen, or comment on our socials or YouTube. It makes a difference and is so appreciated. If you're interested in volunteering, graphic design, research skills, copy editing, or assisting with transcription, or have another talent to lend, let us know. Drop me a line at SamanthaGoldman@refusefascism.org. As always, many, many thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tingleben for helping produce this episode. Thanks to incredible volunteers, we have transcripts available for each show, so be sure to visit refusefascism.org and sign up to get them in your inbox. Until next Sunday, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.